Welcome to HTML 0 to Hero YouTube series. In last video we learned about how to create tables and add some styling to the tables. In today's video we'll be learning about how to add classes and IDs to HTML elements. Basically it's a CSS coding, so we'll learn something about CSS coding and some more elements of the HTML. Before we proceed to the tutorial, please subscribe my channel, like the video, comment on the video below to let me know what you like about the video and what more things you would like to learn in HTML. Okay, let's proceed to the tutorial now. Okay, so the styling which we did in the tables, find through elements. As you can see the CSS code here, that's the property. That's the properties of CSS defined to these elements: table, TD and TH. Border color is applied to these elements. Now we will practice CSS classes and ID. Now let's remove this here and add a class. So that's our first class. I named it my class. Class will always be started from the dot, the full stop. And now we will apply this class to our table element. Now that's how we add the class to a specific element. So in this case, this table is applied to my class, meaning it will take all the CSS properties from this class for this table. Now let's save the document and see if it's working. Go back to the document, hit refresh. Here we go. As you can see, that is the default styling. That is the table without styling, and that's our table with the bigger font size and the border color. By targeting the elements and defining CSS through elements, it will target all the elements. So for example, if we define styling to table element, it will apply to all of the tables. But in some cases we need to style some of the table differently. So that's the first table. Now I'm gonna add some different CSS for this table, for our second table. Now let's start creating another class. Or let's call it my second table. Now I'm gonna copy the same properties, change the color here, change font size to a much bigger font, and define this class to our second table. That's the starting of our second table. Now I'm gonna add class attribute, and here I have added the second class which I created, my second table. Now let's save the document, go back to the document to preview, and here we go. As you can see, the second table have a bigger font and the border color is red, as we defined here in our CSS code. One more thing I will add here, that the class is case sensitive. So for example, if I change the case of C to capital and save the document, hit refresh, and here you see that our styling of the table which we defined has been removed now due to the case which we changed. Now if I switch it back to how it was before, save the document, hit refresh, and we have our styling back. That tells us that CSS is case sensitive, and we'll have to take extra precaution when we are writing the CSS code. Now let's start discussing our ID attribute. So that's how we define ID, by adding a hash and the name of the ID. And we can also use it to target elements and define the CSS property. So let's add our ID here and remove this class. ID is equal to my first ID, copy it from here, paste it here. So that's how we define ID. The difference between ID and class is that ID cannot be used for multiple elements, but class can be used for multiple elements. For example, if we have one class and multiple tables, we can use that class to target multiple tables, but in ID we cannot do that. So ID is a unique in the whole document. That's the difference between ID and the class. We can also add ID and class on one single element. So we can also add any class here, where we can define different property with class of CSS, and ID we can have multiple CSS properties, different CSS properties. So that's how it works. Now let's define some CSS properties to this ID and see how it works. Now let's change the font color of this table by using this ID which we have defined. We're gonna go here and define font color, make it green. Now let's save the document, go back to see if it's changed, hit refresh, and there we go, our font color has been changed. Now let's go back to the document and add class to this table as well as the ID to see how it's working, how it's gonna work. So let's add class, adding the same class which we added before, hit refresh, saving the document, and here we go. As you can see, the properties of the second table which we defined through class, and the properties of my first ID which we defined through ID has been applied to this table. We can also add multiple classes to the same table by adding this space. So let's create another class and add into the same attribute by changing, what should we change this time? Now let's change the font family for this table by creating another class. So let's create a class called font, and here we can define the font family, which can be Arial, and let's bold the font size, bold the font style. So bolder. Add this class to the same table. We don't need to add another class attribute for that. We will just add a space and add another class here, just like that, and we'll save the document. Go back to our browser, hit refresh, and here we have our font family changed to Arial font. Now let's apply this class to the table here as well to see how it works. I'm just gonna add space as we did before, define the class name, saving the document, go back to the browser. Now it should also change the font family for this table as well. Hit refresh, and here we go. So that's how we can play around with classes and ID to define the styling for our document. That's pretty much it for the tutorial. Until next tutorial, bye bye.